So, allegedly, Trump is working on plans to invade Greenland. Okay, I'll bite. Even though the best thing for Europe is to mostly ignore the rhetoric, think about Arctic defenses that will last long after the Trump administration, and generally acknowledge that we live in the strangest timeline. Yes, fresh off the fracas in Caracas, the Trump administration has publicly made some vague but intimidating comments about controlling Greenland, further removing itself from the traditional liberal order. Meanwhile, Zelensky was in Paris meeting with Western diplomats and world leaders about crafting security guarantees post-ceasefire. Yeah, it is easy to forget that the largest land war in Europe since the days of Stalin is still ongoing. One hopes that the security guarantees will work better than Macron's pen as he was trying to sign them. Anyway, while there, the leaders of Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the United Kingdom issued a joint statement on Greenland, which basically says, can we not do this? Without referencing specific action that might happen in Greenland. All of this is a mess, ranging from the report of invasion plans to the absence of public discourse on what Trump's underlying thought process is here, to the lack of understanding that some of the things that Europe is trying to leverage are actually counterproductive. So let's try to get to the bottom of it today. And let's start at the top by discussing why Trump finds the whole thing valuable. Regarding strategic value, the ice caps up north are melting. At some point in the near future, commercial ships will regularly be able to traverse through the fabled Northwest Passage, which I recently learned is not named for Kim and Kanye's kid. And there'll also be other routes available through the Arctic. These will drastically cut down shipping times from Asia and to either Europe or the US East Coast. My condolences to the Panama Canal. But that means that the area around Greenland will become critical for the US Navy's three favorite words: freedom of navigation. However, this consideration is virtually irrelevant to any US decision to annex Greenland. The stock video that you have been primarily watching, and will continue to watch for a good chunk of this video, comes from the Bidufik Space Base, which you may know under its previous designation as Thule Air Base. Lest anyone forget, and this will be important for the second half of the video, Denmark is a member of NATO, and one of the primary benefits of the United States allying with NATO partners is that the United States can establish military bases inside of their borders. That includes this one in Greenland. Under more traditional circumstances, if a US president were concerned about maritime security around Greenland, he could call the Danish Prime Minister and say that he wants to establish a new naval base there. The Danish Prime Minister would say, cool, and that would be the end of the conversation. Well, maybe if it were Biden, he would throw in the dad joke, no, it's cold. But you get the idea. The other half of Greenland's value is that with the ice melting, more of its natural resources will become available. But this is not a good argument for trying to purchase the territory. Everyone is well aware of the new value Greenland might bring, and so that would only raise any sale price by an equal amount. I discussed that calculation almost a year ago, so I suggest checking out that video rather than hearing me rehash it now. But that sets up the notion that Trump has asked military officials to draw up invasion plans. Sounds interesting enough, and it made plenty of rounds on social media. Now, is it true? I do not know. But the report came from the Daily Mail, and if you know a little bit about the United Kingdom, then you might remember that the Daily Mail has a reputation for being just a bit sensationalist. Of course, the overall story on Greenland is dominating the headlines, and there is a convenient way to avoid falling for such sensationalist takes, thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. All you need is a couple of clicks to sort by news agencies with high factual accuracy. Hooray! And while you are there, why not check the daily briefing to see other critical news stories of the day? Trump warns Cuba to make a deal. It seems like the "Will the United States invade country X" video is becoming its own genre. Or lawmakers caution Trump against military strikes on Iran, interestingly getting more attention from right-leaning outlets. More pressing for today's topic, Greenland rare earth mining faced billions in costs, years of delays. Something to keep in mind when calculating the economic value of the island. And by going to ground.news/lines on maps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan, which gives you access to everything I have shown you here and more. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. The credibility of invasion plans or not, Trump's apparent obsession over Greenland goes beyond the territory. Indeed, there is something else going on here specifically as it relates to Denmark. And really, the only reason I am doing this video is because I've wanted to tell this story for months now. It comes straight from the previous NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg's recent book. The chapter on the subject is super captivating, and it tells us everything that we ought to know about Greenland, the last decade of NATO politics, and how Mark Rutte became the current Secretary General. Rewind to the summer of 2018, and the annual NATO summit attended by all 29 of the Allies' leaders at the newly opened Brussels headquarters. It would become the most consequential summit since the 2014 Wales Summit, because its agenda drew a direct line from 4 years earlier. You will recall that in Wales, the Allies pledged to spend 2% of GDP on defense. Well, by Brussels, there had been hardly any realized increase in spending at all, even despite Russia having annexed Crimea. Surely Putin would stop there. Trump was upset that the Allies were continuing to free-ride, despite decades of complaints from the United States, and their own pledge to ramp up spending from not too long ago. What I'm going to recount now is Stoltenberg's own assessment of the meeting, with a few of my own interjections along the way. NATO is important, but it's way more important for Europe than the United States, Trump said. American presidents have come here and said this for many years. Then they've gone home and nothing has happened. Either you pay 2% immediately, within a few months, or by January 1st. Otherwise, we're going to do our own thing. We have no choice. As Trump made his demands, German Chancellor Angela Merkel walked over to Stoltenberg and whispered, "We can't just let this pass." Stoltenberg sent the meeting to a break, during which he conferred with Merkel, Macron, and Rutte, who was still Prime Minister of the Netherlands at this point. The press had begun to hear whispers of what was happening behind closed doors, and some were suggesting that this was the end of NATO. When the meeting reconvened, Stoltenberg placed 3 items on the agenda. 1. There needed to be a public endorsement of Article 5. 2. Everyone had to acknowledge the need for increased defense spending. And 3. The Allies needed to come to the next summit with clear evidence of increases. Trump interjected. Next year? What does next year mean? That's way too late. This is what always happens. We have to talk about this now. Otherwise, we're not going to be friends. I'm leaving this meeting. There is no reason for me to be here anymore. Stoltenberg could sense that he was on the verge of overseeing the de facto end of NATO indeed. Merkel then spoke. We have to take this back to our parliaments and national assemblies. I will fight hard to meet the 2% target in 2024, but I simply don't have the majority for anything more than that right now. Afterward, Trump started going down the line, calling out everyone's current defense spending. The best of his comments. Slovenia, less than 1%. I'm not surprised. I know my wife. I know what she spends money on. What happened next tells you everything that you need to know about how Mark Rutte became Secretary General. Rutte took the floor and told Trump, Mr. President, you have urged us to spend more, and I agree with you. And that is exactly what we are doing. Just last year, we spent $33 billion more on defense because of your leadership. Trump nodded in approval and slipped Stoltenberg a note. If you can say that the NATO allies have significantly increased their defense spending thanks to me, then I think we can agree. Rutte, better than anyone else in that room, understood how to speak Trump's language. Stoltenberg then attempted to end the meeting, with 12 speakers still left. Virtually everyone there realized how precarious the situation was, so they were ready to take the win and follow Stoltenberg's lead. but the Danish Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen refused to yield the floor. Stoltenberg was furious inside, realizing that this could open a can of worms that could cause everything to spiral out of control. But it was the Prime Minister's right, and so on he went. Sharing the burden isn't just about money, Mr. President. It's about blood and sacrifice. Denmark is a country of only 5 million people, and we have lost 45 soldiers in Afghanistan. He then pointed out that this was a greater fatality rate per capita than the United States had suffered. On one hand, I get where he was coming from. On the other, he was completely failing to read the room, and it was not the devastating critique that he envisioned it to be. The statistical value of a human life is about $10 million. I know people hate to equate human suffering with a dollar figure, but in the real world, there are trade-offs. There may be a dangerous stretch of road that will eventually kill a person if it is not fixed. But money is a scarce resource, and if it will cost more than $10 million, then the fix is not worth it. Put differently, governments can and do think about this trade-off. And notably, not once, as I have presented on crisis bargaining to rooms full of military folks, has anyone objected to the notion that you can and do convert life to land. Money is just the next step. Well, 45 Danish fatalities equates to $450 million. Divide that over a 20-year mission, and the per-year cost was $22.5 million. Meanwhile, in 2018, Denmark's GDP was about $355 billion. Thus, the contribution of those fatalities was about 0.00006% of GDP. In no way did it bridge the gap that was infuriating Trump. In fact, the gap is what frustrated Bush administration officials back in 2001. You might recall that the United States did not invoke Article 5 after September 11th. The philosophy was that the Pentagon did not have the time to become experts on the Danish armed forces, or any other country's armed forces, when they were not going to add significant firepower. Rather, European allies wanted to invoke Article 5 because they did not want to set the precedent of an ally being attacked and NATO not triggering the measure. The Bush administration gave the thumbs up to the plan, but did not expect to be blown away with the help, given Europe's post-Cold War military degradation. So, yes, the United States owed a debt of gratitude for the Allied lives lost in Afghanistan. Those would have been American lives instead. But it did not make up for failing to live up to the Wales Pledge. Eventually, Stoltenberg got back control of the meeting and ended it. Trump remained angry about the Danish position, and it may still be driving some of his thinking about Greenland today. And even though Trump's public and private position on NATO has removed walking away from NATO as an option, the 2018 meeting continues to cloud the public discourse on transatlantic relations. So that takes care of why we have reached this point with Trump. We still have to address what will happen next with Greenland, though. That itself involves two sub-questions, addressing what Europe and the United States will each individually do. Europe's response has been a bit of a mixed bag. You will note that the letter from those top European leaders feels more like it is making an academic point than letting the political sparks fly. That is the right approach if Trump is doing this to get under their skin. Better to just shrug it off than seriously engage with it. Meanwhile, you have the Prime Minister of Denmark taking a more reactionary approach, discussing how the invasion of Greenland is the invasion of Denmark, and thus the end of NATO. Well, that just lobs the ball right back at Trump to engage with this even longer. Also, I do not think warning the United States that invading Greenland would end NATO is the threat that she thinks it is. Yes, obviously, long-run U.S. security interests would be wrecked by that. However, Europe remains the one that benefits more from the relationship, at least when it's functioning well. So, really, that comment is just highlighting how the United States has more leverage in the game of chicken than Denmark or Europe does. A rough equivalent here is Putin selling gas to Europe, Europe believing that it would create a dependency that Russia would not want to break off, only for Putin to gamble that, no, Europe is even more dependent, and thus will allow Russia to do whatever it wants in Ukraine. In contrast, the United Kingdom has taken a more constructive approach by forming a plan to deploy European soldiers to Greenland. I cannot stress this point enough. It is easy for the media to treat this as a Trump-specific problem. It is not. There are a lot of folks in the US national security establishment who believe that if Europe thinks that Greenland is a part of Europe, something that they agree with, then Europe should be primarily responsible for Greenland security. It is basically the same story with Ukraine and Russia. That is primarily a European security issue, and thus ought to be primarily Europe's responsibility. The United States will still assist with parts of this, like, say, early warning radar installations. But the solution to the security issue up north is not for the United States to completely develop Greenland's military infrastructure. Europe will commonly counter that there is no immediate threat to the Arctic, and thus no reason to invest in it yet. The US establishment is not impressed by that argument. They would counter that Europe also thought that there was no immediate threat on its eastern flank, and thus has been out of position for the last 4 years in its protection of Ukraine. So, to recap, the United States wants Europe to invest more in Greenland's defense. The United States makes vague threats about Greenland. Europe responds by doing exactly what the United States wants. You will see a bunch of social media commentary that Europe is really sticking it to the United States by doing so, when it is unclear whether any of the policymakers see it that way. It is basically a microcosm of the larger burden-sharing problem. Trump complains that Europe is not spending enough to protect Western interests. He threatens to withdraw. European voters get angry and begin raising defense spending to protect themselves in the absence of protection from the United States, and thus deliver exactly what Trump sought. Hawkish European politicians are all too happy with the song and dance, because now they finally get what they have always wanted. I hate stressing this so much, but here goes. There is a lot of online discussion that treats this as a Trump problem, and certainly there are quite a few Trump quirks to this situation. But it is not a Trump problem. It is a problem that will persist into the next administration, whoever ends up leading it. Europe cannot be thinking about trying to temporarily appease Trump here, lest we find ourselves in this situation again. Lost in all of this is an apparent public ignorance of how the US domestic political system works. I have no doubt that the United States would buy Greenland if the price was right. Not just Trump, but a huge majority of Congress would support that as well. Okay, well, recall Lines Logic 101. The sale price of a piece of territory depends on expectations of what would happen if the situation were to spiral into a military conflict. That is part of how the United States got the Louisiana Purchase for what was apparently a paltry sum of money. France was not in position to militarily defend it. So you can understand why Trump, even if he had no actual intention to run a military operation, is perfectly content to just let that notion circulate. That is also why, even if the Daily Mail had a real source that said that Trump was doing this, I would still not read much into it. Just as I would not read much into a Kremlin source that says that Russia will keep fighting until the end. Politician leaks information benefiting politician is not a title that generates clicks, even if it is more descriptively accurate. Oh, also, the United States keeps an invasion plan on file for literally every country as a general contingency, so learning that there were invasion plans for Greenland would still tell us nothing. The more telling piece of information is US law on the subject. You need an act of Congress to expand US territory. And in Congress, you have Republican majority leaders. Again, Republican majority leaders who want nothing to do with this. John Kennedy, Republican senator from Louisiana, perhaps said it best. Invading Greenland would be weapons-grade stupid. Quick reminder, the Trump administration cannot even convince Congress to officially change the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. How are they going to acquire land that Congress will refuse to acknowledge? So, with your blessing, I plan to go to the Winchester, have a nice cold pint, and wait for all of this to blow over. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Head over to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a fantastic 40% off a Vantage plan. You can also expand on today's topic by watching this video about the problems with bargaining over Greenland and how the economics of it make no sense. And if you enjoyed this video, then please like, share, and subscribe. We just passed the 750,000 mark, so thanks for that. Help me finish it, and I will see you next time. Take care.